The topic for today's didactic is psychological impact of trauma, abuse, and violence. So let's first talk about what are the learning objectives of this didactic. First, we'll try to understand what is violence, abuse, and trauma. We'll understand the psychological impact of violence. We'll also understand the state of mind. So the state of mind comprises of cognition, behavior, and emotion, which we'll be talking in detail in this didactic, and the coping mechanisms to reduce stress resulting from the trauma. So first, let's understand what violence, abuse, and trauma is. So violence, according to World Health Organization, is the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community. So it can be towards an individual, by an individual, or it can be towards a group or a community by a group or community as well, which either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. So we have to understand it's an intentional use of physical force or power, okay, to cause injury, some kind of harm, psychological, physical, or deprivation. Now, abuse, according to American Psychological Association, is an interaction in which one person behaves in a cruel, violent, demeaning, or invasive manner towards another person or an animal. Abuse can come in various forms, such as pattern of harmful behavior, verbal or physical abuse, assault, any kind of violation. It can be just violation of privacy, rape, unjust practices, crimes, and other types of aggression. And lastly, understanding trauma, as per the American Psychological Association's definition, it's any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings, or it can be experiencing any other kind of emotions as well. It can be not just fear and helplessness, it could be anger also, intense enough to have a long lasting negative effect on the person's attitude, behavior, and other aspects of functioning. So this is what we understand about violence, abuse, and trauma. So as you can understand, trauma meaning any disturbing experience. So every time there's a violence or an abuse, there is a very high likelihood that the person may be experiencing trauma as a result of which. Now, why is it important to learn about the psychological impact of violence or abuse? So people are not aware that they are being abused. A lot of times people remain unaware of the fact that they are being abused. Most of the time, when the violence is not physical or sexual and it's just emotional violence or like very subtle ways of discrimination happening, people a lot of times are unaware that they are being abused. There's a lack of self-awareness about their own mental health. So in most of us till date, we don't have a lot of awareness and action towards our mental health. We take care of our physical health, but not of our mental health that much. We need to identify people who are vulnerable and situations who are at high risk of violence, abuse, and trauma. So in our society or in certain places, people are particularly vulnerable, maybe because of their caste, maybe because of their race, their religion, or because of their gender. For example, what we are talking or focusing on this in this training, that is the vulnerability due to the gender, that is women experiencing violence from men. And also, it is important to learn about the psychological impact of violence and abuse because that will help us in early prevention. So now let's understand what is the state of mind. As I was talking about, that the state of mind comprises of cognition, that is the thoughts, feelings, that's the emotion, or we also call it as affect, AFFECT, or behavior. So these are interconnected. So the thoughts impacts feelings and behavior, feelings impacts thoughts and behavior impacts thoughts and feelings. Now let's understand these three components of the state of mind separately. Talking about cognition. So suppose there's a irrational, due to trauma or abuse or the violence that the person is experiencing, there is a rise of irrational thoughts in our mind. These irrational thoughts are illogical, may not be based on evidence, operate mostly on assumptions rooted in beliefs. So just for an example, if a person or a group of people have been experiencing trauma due to the violence or the abuse that they are experiencing, they tend to find or see things or process information in an illogical way. That is, even if somebody is not being abusive or violent towards that person, the person who has been experiencing violence may all perceive it as a threat. In that process they may start thinking in an illogical way. Now that gives rise to a negative view of self and others, that may be in form of hopelessness, helplessness, or worthlessness, that I am not worthy of anything. I'm worthy of this abuse or violence. I deserve this, or there is nobody who can help me, or there is no way that this situation can improve, or this will remain like this. And that impacts our cognition. So what happens? We keep having repetitive, unpleasant thoughts. Our decision making gets affected. We have poor concentration and also forgetfulness. So this is just one example of how the cognition can get affected due to repeated violence and trauma. So how does irrational thought look like? So maybe we'll have statements like, it was all my fault. So a woman who has been experiencing violence may have thoughts like this: it was all my fault. I cannot share my problems with anyone. Maybe a woman who experiences violence by her husband goes and talks about it to the family, and the family doesn't validate and say that it's okay, this is your family matter, you need to resolve this. Every husband beats their wife. This is how it happens. It's okay, you will get through it. So with that kind of a response, they tend to make this assumption that, okay, probably I cannot share my problems with anyone. Whole world is like this, I cannot trust anyone anymore. Or I deserve to be punished, I cannot go against them. There is no point of living anymore. Or this is my fate. So these could be some of the irrational thoughts. Now moving to the maladaptive emotions. Now, like maladaptive thoughts, maladaptive emotions are also direct reactions to the past situations that no longer help the person to cope constructively with situations that elicit them in the present. So because of the past violence, they have learned a way to respond in such a way in the present that it is maladaptive. So, for example, this flow chart will help you understand is like, suppose there is a traumatic incident, maybe a sexual assault or an ongoing event like a intimate partner violence. So the woman is getting beaten by the husband over the years. That gives rise to faulty reasoning on the information processing that we were talking about in the maladaptive thought process. This will trigger past experiences, as a result of which it will activate the negative view of self, others, and the world, which is, we talked about helplessness, hopelessness, and worthlessness. That I am not worthy of any good treatment. I am worthy of this violence, this abuse. Nobody can help me, and my life is going to be like this. I have to just accept it. As a result of which the person starts experiencing high amount of negative emotions and also starts expressing these emotions. So what could be some of these negative emotions? Like sadness, shame, guilt, anger, disgust, etc. So now let's understand some of the ways these maladaptive emotions can get manifested. For example, number one being emotional dysregulation. So it is the use of maladaptive emotion regulation strategies in the face of overwhelming negative emotions. So such strategies include self-harm, attempting suicide, or attempting to inhibit, affect, or excessive substance use. So for example, if there is an overwhelming negative emotion, okay, for example, a woman being doubted by her husband for having an extramarital affair. So what could be the maladaptive emotional regulation strategy? She tries to cut her wrist with a sharp object. Okay. Instead, what could be the adaptive strategy? The woman having a direct conversation, communication with the husband and trying to resolve it. Okay. But probably the woman has been abused and violated by the husband for so many years that the woman knows that is not, has learned that this is not going to work. Okay. So the information processing, the thought process has become maladaptive, as a result of which she knows that there is nobody who can help her. Nothing is going to change. So she has started regulating her emotions in a maladaptive way, as a result of which she'll cut her wrist with a sharp object. This is just an example. The maladaptive emotional dysregulation can be in other format as well. Emotional suppression, it is are the feelings consciously avoided because the person doesn't know exactly how to deal with it. For example, a woman constantly faces psychological abuse from her husband. He would regularly scream at her and demand her to do things that she does not like to do. She tries not to think about whatever he does, as those feelings make her feel uncomfortable. With time, it is noticed that she has been experiencing pains in different parts of the body and mostly has a very low mood for weeks together. So, if you see here, this woman has been experiencing psychological abuse for very long, and she would regularly scream and demand her. He would regularly scream and demand her to do things. So, there has been a lot of abuse and violence from his side. She over the years has learned how not to think about whatever he does, and because those feelings makes her uncomfortable, so she kind of suppresses the feelings, as a result of which later she starts experiencing unexplained pains in different parts of the body. So this is like what we were talking about in the previous session in somatization, where the unresolved pain, the unresolved feelings which are not expressed get suppressed and comes out in the form of various physical discomfort. We'll talk about emotional repression. So, emotional repression happens when uncomfortable emotions such as anger, frustration, sadness, fear, etc., are unconsciously avoided. So, suppression was consciously the woman was trying to forget or suppress the emotions. Here, it is unconsciously happening. So, this also leads to mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression. So, for example, a child who was abused by a parent represses the memories and becomes completely unaware of them as an adult. This repressed memories of abuse may still affect this person's behavior by causing difficulty in forming relationships. So, what happens? The child who has been abused by the parent as a child will not remember those abusive memories where he was abused, but the child, it will get manifested in a way where the child will constantly have difficulty in trusting people in future or forming a healthy positive relationship in future. Rumination, another form of maladaptive emotion, where it is defined as thinking repetitively and passively about negative mood states or about the causes and consequences of negative mood. So, this is also very commonly associated with depression. So, for example, a woman was beaten by her husband a month back. She finds it difficult to forget because of the intensity of pain and shame that she had to go through in front of people. She would keep thinking about what happened whenever she's doing any work. So she can't focus on anything else that she's doing now. The quality of household work and other chores get affected, and she feels that she has not been able to concentrate well to complete the task, since all that she thinks about is how her husband had beaten her up in front of everyone a month ago. Now, moving to the maladaptive behavior. Now, the behaviors that help in temporary relief from the intense emotions, they are the poor coping mechanism. So it is one way of coping with the difficult negative emotions or the difficult thought process, but it is a poor mechanism. They adapt or modifies or adjusts, but it in a poor way. They're not healthy or productive, and the behavior is used continuously to avoid the perceived negative situation in the individual. Now, what can be some of the example of the maladaptive behavior? Now, some of the high risk behaviors, self-harm or suicide attempt, which we were talking about earlier, unprotected sex, okay? Addictive behavior such as alcohol, smoking and abuse of other drugs, social media, shopping and gaming, internet gaming or gambling, which has become very common these days. Otherwise, not high risk behavior, but other type of maladaptive behavior examples could be avoidance behavior, which could be decreased self-care. So the person has stopped taking care of herself. Social withdrawal, okay, or isolating oneself. The woman doesn't enjoy things that she would enjoy earlier. She doesn't do things like she doesn't like dressing up anymore. She doesn't talking to her family members or her friends or going out or whatever her hobbies or interests were earlier. She has lost interest, gradually started losing interest in them, and is gradually withdrawing or isolating herself. Now let's talk about what are the coping mechanisms. Now that we have understood how the cognition, emotion, and behavior are interrelated, and how a maladaptive cognition can result in maladaptive way of emotion, that is emotional dysregulation, and result in maladaptive behavior in the form of high risk behavior or social withdrawal or isolation. Now we'll talk about what are the coping mechanisms. So when there is abuse, this violence, this trauma, how do we cope with that situation? Okay. So coping is defined as thoughts and behaviors that people use consciously or unconsciously as a strategy while facing stressful situations. So all individuals have basic needs to feel competent, to relate and be connected to others. When there is a challenge or threat to these needs, coping strategies are used. So let's try to classify coping mechanisms, whether it's emotion focused coping or problem focused coping. So, what is emotion focused coping? Emotion focused coping refers to people's efforts to manage their emotional responses to stress. For example, venting out, distracting oneself, denial. So, in the face of a abuse or a trauma, the person is trying to vent out. Okay, so like sharing or discussing about the problem, distracting. Okay, so whenever there is a lot of distress happening, so the person is actively trying to distract oneself or denying. Okay, so completely cutting oneself out of that. Problem focused coping strategies include thinking about solutions, okay, taking direct actions to solve the problem, seeking help from others. So these are the two types of coping behaviors. Now, apart from that, whether be it problems are focused or emotion focused, coping mechanisms can be healthy and it can also be unhealthy. So you can understand, so coping is the way that we adapt to or try to deal with situations that are stressful. Now, what are the healthy coping mechanisms? Enhancing self help seeking behavior. So suppose you are experiencing trauma or abuse, so talking to family members, talking to friends, taking professional help, this could be healthy coping. Setting boundaries. Okay, so from whoever you're getting facing the violence or abuse, you're trying to set boundaries and you're trying to actively solve the problem so that you don't face the abuse or violence further. Expressing and communicating. On the other hand, the unhealthy coping, okay, which is very common because of the kind of violence that the person experiences and the trauma the person experiences, the person is not able to think in an adaptive way. So as a result of which, there is a lot of maladaptive thought process resulting in emotional dysregulation and maladaptive behavior, which is forms the coping mechanism, which is also unhealthy. So what could be some of the unhealthy coping? Consuming alcohol or smoking or other drugs, ignoring your feelings. So if you can see the first point, consuming alcohol, this is a maladaptive behavior which we were talking about. Ignoring the feelings. Okay, so this is like suppression, emotional suppression or emotional repression if unconsciously done. So that's a maladaptive emotion. Normalizing. Okay, that okay, I am supposed to be abused like this, or it's normal. Every woman gets abused like this. My mother was abused like this. My grandmother was abused like this. Every woman in my neighborhood gets abused like this. So it's normal. Okay. So this is a maladaptive way of thinking. It's a maladaptive thought process. Depending on others. Okay. Not thinking that, okay, I can solve the problem. Or other things like maladaptive behavior like gaming, shopping, overeating, gambling, etc.